And welcome to our webinar series of 2016 of the Art of the Possible. This is Diana Krupa, and I will be your host today for this webinar, and we're going to be exploring the beautiful Silver River in Florida. And we have a couple people joining. We have John Sloat, who is the CTO of WaterCube, as well as Dr. Art Schmidt, Assistant Research Professor of University of Illinois. And we'll show you their mugshots in a minute. But we have also some information about a webinar series that we are going to be continuing through the rest of this year. And every month, we're going to be bringing you a case study and specific topics with respect to, today it's mostly about mapping the springs and habitat studies and invasive vegetation. In the next one that we'll be focusing on is hydrokinetic power, and looking for stream power through our streams and rivers, as well as in tidal estuaries. And then we're going to continue our series with modeling calibration studies and furthering that into flow monitoring and velocity indexing. So as I mentioned, we have 3 people today on the line that are going to be the presenters. John Sloat, CTO, and then Art Schmidt. And so we wanted to at least give you a brief introduction of what WaterCube is. We have quite a few new people on the line and some that are already familiar with us. And thank you, too, for the water management districts in joining today. There's quite a few of you on the line out of Florida. But what is WaterCube? WaterCube is a software and services company. We provide a complete workflow. But in that workflow, not only do we assist in the data collection, but we have developed a big data processing engine for analyzing very vast amounts of river and reservoir data by utilizing many instruments on the market, agnostic of the brand. And then we visualize that and manage it through our back-end software, which is called Cubeit. So how does this apply to this industry? So there's many, many applications where you would be able to apply WaterCube process results, which is basically giving you bathymetry and the velocities spatially throughout a river reach, and apply that to specific studies you may have with respect to in-stream flow studies or velocity indexing. Hydropower applications, as I mentioned, with stream power, which will be one of our case studies. River restoration and sediment transport. And the 3 topics we'll be talking about today specifically are around aquatic habitat studies, looking at the flow and water quality, as well as developing hydrodynamic models and calibrating that to some of the real spatial data being collected. So technology's come a long way. For those of you who do know John Sloat, he has been working in the field quite a long time, along with Dr. Art Schmidt. But John is very familiar with ADCPs and the full, I guess, segue into a more integrated multi-platform sensor, which enables not only the people that are out collecting the data to have GPS completely integrated with the ADCP, but it allows them to more quickly collect data and be able to process that data more rapidly as we have evolved into using multiple instruments on the water. So today we can take multiple ADCPs down the river, and we'll talk about that in more detail later, where John will talk about go with the flow methodology to take all of that together and process it very rapidly. But there are still technology challenges in that. So even though we've come a long way with the technology we put on the water and the gear, there's still some processing challenges because it's still a very complicated workflow. And there's no real easy way to QA and process all of the data that's coming from multiple instruments. Simultaneously, you may be incorporating LiDAR as well, and that can become a very complex task. So the last piece of this, where we visualize and manage those results, is really to enable our scientists and researchers out there to have the data at your fingertips so that you can analyze the complete visual view and the analytics underneath that data. So WaterCube is essentially a complete workflow and an integrated visual solution for managing your river, from enabling you to put advanced technology on the water and apply that in a way that approaches a different type of methodology, we also then provide the advanced technology in terms of the processing engine to deliver results very rapidly, giving you a complete digital elevation model, and then enable your visualization through the software on the back end. So quick recap of what we provide. Our processing services are a component that we enable our customers to either have a complete cube of a river, which can be many miles or kilometers, with a DEM and included with LiDAR. We also provide a subset of that type of data, which we call subcube, which is a maybe higher resolution view of a smaller portion of the river. And then another product is our single line projection, which enables multiple cross sections and promoting or projecting that onto a specific line so that you can do 1D, 2D type habitat studies. So more like the traditional transects, yet a different approach for projecting that and getting higher resolution data for that transect. And then bathymetry for either reservoirs or even through the river itself. We take that process data and we put that into our back-end Cubeit software, and that's what's really enabling you then to have your visual tools and to analyze and to manage that data over time, both seasonally and to look at different flow events. So as we go forward, we are now going to share a case study with you on the Silver River in Ocala. And I wanted to give special thanks to the St. John's River Management District and many of the groups that participated in this with us. So from the hydrodynamic modeling team led by Pete Sushi, we want to definitely thank them for collaborating with us on their models and looking at the spatial data and how that may validate some of the work that they're doing. The hydrologist and field team being led by Mitch Rainwhite and Ross Davis. We thank them for all of their time in the field, working with us to collaborate on the technology as well as getting the right type of data. And then the engineers and scientists, of course, working on this both from the University of Florida. There's some case studies in here for some dye testing we'll be sharing with you as well. But the whole project is being led by Ed Carter, and we've been working very closely with him to analyze these results, and you'll be seeing a poster here shortly that will also showcase what they've been sharing with other districts in Florida. So let me introduce John Sloat, and he's going to be sharing the case study on the Silver River.
Thank you, Diana, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar. We have, for about the past 18 months, been working very closely with St. John's Water Management District, and I look forward to showing you some of those results and discussing some of the complexities that we overcame during the way. So just to start it off, this is really a discussion about the Silver River and the minimum flow levels. One of the problems was that several years ago, the flows, there was a rather dramatic decrease in the flow rate from the springs, and understanding the causes really requires evaluating that river over several seasons and certainly several conditions. So from the hydrodynamic point of view, the approach was to develop by the district was to develop a three-dimensional hydrodynamic model that would assess conditions, the impact of SAV, submerged aquatic vegetation in the river, possible backwater effects of the aqua, basically to allow them to understand better how that river works and how it operates and how they can understand better what's going on with these flows. Any type of modeling effort like this, particularly on the Silver River or any types of rivers of those conditions, requires a lot of depth and velocity data. They are very complex sections. They change seasonally, and they need this data in order to perform these types of modeling approaches. Some of the measurement complexities, I'm sure some of you on the line are familiar with. In particular to the Silver River, there's a tree canopy that exists almost completely along the reach of the river. It doesn't block completely the river, but there's getting good GPS coverage for data collection, for georeferencing all of the data is very difficult. The river itself has rapid changes in depths and velocities almost continually down the river, It's about 8.5 or so kilometers. It's a karst terrain riverbed. That means there's a lot of undulation as you go, not just left to right across the stream, but as you go downstream. The river, of course, is a winding, narrow river with lots of aquatic vegetation and soft riverbed conditions. So these things, by this, collaborating with them, we selected the appropriate technology, the appropriate methodology to be able to capture this data in greater detail. The last part of that was really the data processing and the analysis complexities, meaning what do you do with all of this data once you have it? And so at present, or previously, there was some multiple scripts, multiple programs. They required several months, or possibly not several, but a few months at least to even prepare the data for analysis. It was a challenge to the modelers to get this accurate data to begin their calibration and validation processes, as well as to even manage the data from these multiple events. So the approach was, and you're seeing it here, we're telling you what we did, but this took a lot of collaboration, both with collecting the data in the field, selecting the right equipment. We didn't just come up with this plan immediately. This evolved over a period of months. But ultimately, what we settled on is that we're using multiple ADCP GPS instruments as we sweep the river from the head spring to its confluence with the Ocklawaha River, and actually a little bit further down the river. At times, they will use underwater video to assess the SAVs and to look at the riverbed terrain to be able to get an understanding of what was down there and how that might affect the technology and the data collection. For the spatial data, we typically collected 10 to 12 downstream transects. That's with this catchy phrase, go with the flow. Again, it's very advantageous in this case because these currents are relatively slow. Going with the flow reduces the currents along the transducer face. Your data is cleaner. There's several intensive data collection sites along the river's course. At those sites, rather than just relying on the spatial data, they performed what we call these velocity transects, and which were really where we collected very high resolution data at a fixed point multiple times across the river. Simultaneous to that, they were sampling velocities and depth under the vegetation. This data, it's a massive amount of data. The data now is being collected and processed on a quarterly basis. Typically from the beginning, from when the instrument first hits the water to when the data delivers, depending upon timing, is in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 weeks at most. So it's a pretty rapid turnaround with a lot of data buttoned together rather nicely. Here's a poster that Ed Carter put together. I'm just going to highlight a few little things. Some of it is what I've already discussed, but this is just giving you an overview of kind of introducing, like I have, about some of the challenges that they were attempting to address, a little bit about the methodology with the ADCPs, the products that are now being delivered to them, and certainly the challenges and the strengths of this project. This is also going to be available, I believe, for download from our site. I'd highly recommend you take a look at it because it's a very nice snapshot of the work being done on the silver. So let's talk about the approach to this data collection. Just to start it off, just to put it into context, here's an aerial of the Silver River, and you can see the spring head is up here, and again, there's a series of springs through this section, and then it channelizes, and it's this long, windy, narrow river in the middle of a swamp. Here's its confluence with the Ocklawaha River. And the survey actually ends, this is the State Road 40 bridge that crosses the Ocklawaha, and the survey ends in proximity to this. I'm going to zoom in here so you can get an idea of the spring head. Again, here's the Mammoth Spring. This is the main spring vent. There are several springs as you go immediately downstream. I'm probably not pointing them all out, but you can see there's several springs that are contributing. And as the river comes down into the channel, this is actually where their flow gauging station is. This is where flow is monitored. I'm going to sweep back here. It's kind of hard to see on the aerial, but you can see this is a back channel. Okay, now when you're modeling something like the Silver River, this presents an added complexity. So what they've done on some of the surveys, they will actually track this. These are the actual track lines showing the data collection locations. As you can see, as it sweeps down into the channel, it's more into that go with the flow technique that we were discussing. Okay. Just to give you an idea of the type of aquatic vegetation that they typically deal with, here's a pretty representative section. Here we're out that day with the dual frequency echo sounder. This was not a part of the study, but this was just us sampling some data to see how well this type of instrument performed. But also you can see the canopy here. It's a nice view of the heavy canopy that we had to deal with. So on to the results, at least a few of them. Here's just a quick snapshot. In the upper left is the velocity grid. That's the Silver River here. This is the colors here, the velocity grid with the elevation model. So basically what we're looking at, this is the LiDAR data that was provided by the district, and we stitched it together with the depth data measured by the ADCPs to form the elevation grid. And then we inlaid the three-dimensional velocity that was collected with the ADCPs. I pulled out a section here just to give you an idea of this narrow, windy river. And if you look, you can see the karst features here clearly. Some of this will be affected by the vegetation, of course, but again, put this in context of trying to model this in 3D. Flows are changing rapidly as it goes down, almost continually, I should say, as it goes down the river's course. You can see the windy, the bends, the sharp bends, the ups and downs. The blues, just for your reference, represent very low, very slow water. The reds are the higher speeds. Okay, so I've just taken this grid and I basically turned off the elevation layer so you can see just the velocity, the 3D velocities that were processed by WaterCube along this reach. So here I'm going to give you just a quick Cubeit professional overview. Whoops, that was my bad there. Let me press this again. So here, what I want to just lay out for you is just kind of the data that we're looking at. And we break the data down into three basic layers, and we call them zones. The first is the DEM. The second is the volume layer that contains all the three-dimensional data that we put in the river. And then there's the depth average layer. So we can enable and disable, which I've just disabled this layer. And it also, in this environment, it's a 3D visualization tool, so I have complete, tilt, pan and tilt and zoom that I can quickly, dive into a river and take a look real quick. Here, I'm looking at a sort of a translucent view of the velocity grid. You can see the colors there. I'm going to take now, again, this is a 1-hour webinar. We could spend several days talking about this, but I'm going to talk about how we can slice different types of views that we can look at the river. So I've zoomed in on a river section, and I'm going to show you how we can look at the velocities, the horizontal layers along the river's course, or the cross-sectional layers. So I'm going to start with the horizontal layers, and I'm going to animate it here. And you can see it's going to step, so this is just it stepping up through from the bottom of the river to the top. And then I'm going to, just for reference, I'll turn on this, I'm going to turn back on this 3D layer. I'm going to make it very translucent so you can see the animation. So there you go. So you can see it coming up through the channel. Now we can also do this in the cross section. Again, this data exists for the entire reach, and I've just zoomed in on a little reach, but this is typically what's done. You're not going to analyze the whole river all the time. You can just zoom into a certain section, look at what you need to look at, and analyze to the level you need to, and then extract that data or visualize it, anyway. So that's the slices. Stream traces is a particle tracking algorithm that we have, and we can set up some seed points, and this is just showing the mean flow paths as it goes through this section. Again, just to give you an idea of the river operation. The last one, this one is a little difficult to show visually in the webinar without the software directly, but these are isobel plots. And basically, I can specify multiple layers of velocity. And what I'm looking at here is all the velocities. I'm just capturing all velocities, for instance, that are above 0.5 meter per second. And you can go on in several layers, multiple layers with this. I can make multiple velocities. But again, it's another way to visualize and understand what is your river, what's it doing. I'm going to flip the layer back on here. There it goes. And so now I've got the LiDAR and the elevation layer basically in context with the entire river reach. Okay. So now we're going to show you a dye tracer study that was done by the University of Florida, and first a big thank you to David Kaplan and Nathan Reaver for providing us this video. I certainly won't attempt to discuss all of the analysis that was done as a part of this, but essentially they performed a dye study on the river, and what I'm showing you here is some snippets of their work. Here they're at the Mammoth Head Spring, and they injected approximately 5 gallons of rhodamine at the main vent, at the Mammoth vent. So you can see the diver down there. What a great job that would be, right? There goes the rhodamine, and now they have a series of fluorometers set up down the river, and they're going to be studying, they're going to be hopefully to be able to help characterize multiple flow paths. So you can see again here some fast forwards of the dye as it beginning to go down the river, and you can see that plume really, and that's really what the water's doing. So it's a nice, very nice visual way to see what's happening there. And as it goes downstream, you're going to begin to see the flow develop into this. It's starting to develop into the channel, which is almost immediately downstream. And then you're going to start to see this back channel, and we zoom forward. You can see this little back eddy that's kind of coming around here. So here, again, it's starting to come into the channel. There's the back channel right there. We're going to talk about that in a minute. We're going to compare this to some of the WaterCube results. Here we are looking at some underwater video, and you can see how the dye is showing you how how it's mixing and how its retention is in the vegetation beds. This is the back channel. Again, in context of trying to model this is a very complex, it's slow velocities, very undulating currents, and very sharp changes in the channel conditions and direction. And you can see the as we go on, this is further down as the plume begins to migrate itself down. So again, this is a way that they're using to be able to understand how does this river work, right? And this is definitely going to be something that you can use to help to verify this calibration model. And sorry, I had my mic on, my audio on there. And the last, of course, there's a lot of wildlife out there. Say hello to the turtle, and a big thank you again to the volunteers, Water Management District, the State Park, Silver Spring State Park, and the University of Florida, certainly for providing us this video. So now we're going to take a look at comparing, or really just taking a look at the tracer study and seeing how that compares to the WaterCube data. Okay, so I'm going to start a video here. Here on the left, before I get started, you can see this is the Mammoth vent, the main vent. And you can see there's that circulation pattern there. And I'm going to start this video again here. And what we're looking at here, again, this is the view of the bathymetry of the depth at the spring head. Here's the Mammoth vent. Okay, you can see the channel here. I'm going down. On this particular survey, they did not survey the back channel, but certainly it's there. I'm going to switch this over to showing you the velocity patterns. So again, relatively low velocities. You can begin to see it channelized here, of course, higher velocities, and you can see it's well mixed. Another way we can look at this is a vector of the cross-sections that we generate as a part of our processing. But clearly you can begin to see these currents circling back here. You can see definitely the currents starting to form and to come down into the channel, and certainly you see the vectors over here starting to go off into the back channel. So we're getting pretty good representation with what they, the characteristics of the dye. The stream traces, again, here are these stream traces. This might be another way that we can see it. Again, these are mean flow lines. Here's the velocities map going off to the back channel, going down to the main stream, and certainly here's the back eddy. We can also animate this just to provide a little bit of extra viewing. So this is just an animation of this. I'm going to turn it back to the depth so we can look at the stream lines with the depth. There we go. And yeah, so here we go. So here, again, here's the main spring vent right here. Here's the flows coming out. They're circling around very slowly, eventually migrating down the channel and into the back channel. So I have pretty good agreement there. And the next one we'll take a look at is, I got this, I'm going to show you another snippet of this back channel video. Hopefully it comes out okay. But here, here's the 14 waterway, or the back channel, and this is just off the main the main channel. And here's going into the far back channel, okay, and these are much slower velocities, and as they migrate through here, here's actually the basin, the marina basin for the glass bottom boats out there. And as the drone comes around, we're going to fly back up to this channel right about here, and we're going to see the velocity. We're going to see how it reconnects back with the stream. And so I'll stop the video here. And again, what we're going to be looking at is this section right through here. So you can see the dye here. There's the main river out there. And then we're going to be looking at this section right here. Okay, so I'll start this video. And you're going to see something very similar. Again, this is the spring vent, the Mammoth vent. Here's the main channel. This is the depth map. Here's the 14 waterway, or the back channel. Here's the section of extremely low velocities, and here's where the higher velocities bend and come along this main channel, this back channel here. I'm going to flip this over to make this. I'll turn this, put this over to the velocity map, and now we can again see there's that circulated flow there. There's the main channel flows. There's a little bit of flow coming into the back channel. Very low velocities down here, and certainly the higher velocities as they take that hard left and come down the channel. I'm going to zoom in here and take a quick look at the vectors. It might help look at it in greater detail. Here we go. So again, you can see, a very distinct pattern where the flows, as they go this channel, they very little velocity going down this channel, which is definitely what the dye study was showing as well. So really, the impetus, or the upshot here is that obviously modeling these types of rivers are complex. It certainly helps to have dye tracer types of tests, WaterCube results. Certainly they compare well, but it's certainly helpful to have them in these complex sections that will ultimately hopefully improve the hydrodynamic modeling effort. So the last thing that I'm going to talk about here are these high-resolution velocity and depth transects over vegetation, I should add. These were done, there's several intensive study sites along the area, along the reach. Again, this river is very long. You can't possibly study everything intensively, so they've identified certain locations and are performing certain studies on these reaches. So in this case, what they're doing is collecting very high resolution depth and velocity transects over the vegetation using the ADCP. And again, this is a part of the processing function that we have, that we use in conjunction with the spatial data. But it basically comprises of making multiple passes across a line. Certainly they try to navigate as close to that line as possible. It's not, because there's a lot of activity on this river, it's not practical or really reliable to string a line up. So they navigate from point to point. They got some very good kayakers there, boatsmen, that have done this for years, and they do an excellent job here, as you can see. So anyway, this is 4 passes we've combined. We project it onto the line. We can subdivide it into a normal cross-sectional type of measurement. Some of the data, obviously, the water depth, the water velocity profile, both the downstream, the cross-stream, all of the velocity information comes along with it. This is it visualized into our Cubeit software in 2D and 3D plots. But again, they're going to look at this over seasonal changes with each event. They're going to look at see how this fixed cross-section changes, because now we have an enormous amount of velocity data along this section. They're also simultaneously collecting velocity data and depth below the vegetation. Okay, so below this cross-section here, you're going to have some area that is going to be vegetation. So the ADCPs don't go through that. They, for better or worse, they track, depending upon the density of the vegetation, they will track, on top of the vegetation. Okay, and again, you collect enough data, you begin to see some realistic patterns that they can begin to look at and understand seasonally. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce one of my very good friends and colleague is Dr. Art Schmidt. He's an associate research professor at the University of Illinois, and I also call him, he's our WaterCube scientist. I have worked personally with Art for, the better part of 2 decades, which makes us old, but we've worked all over the world on several rivers together, and Art has the nice thing, Art has done an enormous amount of field work, a lot of research. So I'm going to just turn it over to you right now, Dr. Schmitz.
All right, thank you. And welcome, hello to everybody. As John, year and a half or so ago, first started talking to me about the things they were doing, I was very excited about the possibility with collecting all these data, but then taking data from multiple different instruments, multiple sources, and putting them together and visualizing them. All of a sudden, we have unprecedented ability to start to really understand what's happening in our rivers. Even things like he was just talking about, coupling the go with the flow measurements with the very high resolution transects. We have in the water resources community decades, perhaps even centuries of practice of measuring at transects, and yet interpolating these very long distances between where we have our cross sections. And so now when we have the go with the flow measurements and we can couple our very high resolution information at select cross sections, but real data as opposed to just interpolations of what's happening in between, it gives a lot of opportunity to understand the things that are going on. Similarly, the ability to pull in different instruments. So he talked about some of the limitations of ADCPs, and yet having the ability then to pull in different instruments starts to open the door that we can look at as what is happening beneath this vegetation layer. How does it change in time? So these next slides and this little video we have here is trying to show how the Cubeit Unlimited part lets us look a little bit at what is happening over time. So what you're seeing right now is a screenshot from Cubeit Unlimited, and we have few things, and we have all of the data. So every single cross section, every slice that has been measured and interpolated from all the measurements is shown. Here we have a zoom in. This is the depth along the river from all the different measurements. So you can see a small change in depth, but the flow. Here we have the speed of the water, and you can very clearly start to see the changes. We have those shallow sections, deeper sections. We can start to look one cross section at a time. Well, I'm sorry, one measurement trip at a time. Or we can couple and put multiple measurements events, so each column in the matrix you're seeing is a different day of going out measuring. And then we have the velocities and depths and other information from that. So what we have, and I really want to zoom in on the bottom section here, what you're seeing now is the same slice, the same location in the river at 6 different measurement trips that have been done. And what the plots are showing is the downstream component of velocity. There's a lot of different information. We could look at downstream velocities or velocity magnitudes or speeds. But this is the downstream component of velocity. The blue is a low velocity, a red is the highest velocity. And then you're coupling that, seeing what the ADCPs have observed as the cross-section of the flow. So as you look at some of these, particularly the middle row, it becomes very apparent as the vegetation has changed. You can see the change in both the cross-section that the ADCP is able to see where the flow is occurring, and also a dramatic change in the velocity, where on the far right, the most recent measurement, we have this core of very high velocities. You can see the one next just left of that. You've got the area where there's some vegetation that's very low velocities, but there is flow, but you go further left, and also the first measurement campaign, and there's no velocities at all. So we're starting to see what's changing underneath our river, both hydrodynamically in terms of the velocities, and also in terms of the vegetation, the cross-section where the flow occurs. And I know, John, I wasn't there for any of these measurements, but you were telling me a little bit more of the physical condition, particularly that most recent data collection effort.
Yeah, well, actually the most recent data collection was just last week that we're actually processing, and that's what I'll be doing.
The last one was
this webinar. So this was the one collected in January, the last one here, and yeah, you can see a notable change in the flow path here. So I'm sure I'll be corrected if I don't get this exactly right, but basically in this case, this represented one of the lowest water level elevations. This is the river slope up here from the head spring all the way down to the Ocklawaha, and you can see that well, what in this case, what I believe was the case is that the Ocklawaha River was drawn down through the reservoir. That reduced the backwater out of the Silver River, which lowered the water levels, but certainly increased the slope and the water velocity. So what you're seeing here is that velocity signal, and again, these are actually going down. These are in 5-meter increments in their entire reach, so we can look down in this section and see the higher velocities, much more significant than they were. And I believe this measurement was done in October. So again, this one here, this was back in 2014 in August. This was the following, let's see, January, then April, and so again we got 6 events here and a 7th one coming, but this one definitely stood out. This is the lowest elevation. There's no backwater on the side, and it definitely increased the velocity through these sections. Okay.
Okay. And you're welcome. Thanks, John. We will talk much more detail a future webinar, but for years we've talked about, can we use either models or data to help guide future data collection efforts? And just as you look at something like this, if you're putting in perhaps a fixed velocity monitoring, a side-looking, up-looking instrument, just graphs like this can start to help you know, where do I need to put my instrument to get a very representative picture of the flow. You couple that with the upper right-hand figure, the velocities, the mean velocities that are shown in that graph. It looks very messy, but John mentioned the karst topography, and you're starting to see, where do we have very low velocities, where do we have high velocities. So you're starting to understand much more about what's happening in your river, and whether you're looking at habitat studies or stream power or scour or putting in an instrument. This lets you, as a scientist, a hydrologist, much better do your job and know what's going on in the river. Another thing that I'm very excited about is we've talked about using this for validating models. And I think that moves us to the next slide, John.
Yes.
Or two.
Yep.
So St. Johns River has put together a 3D model of this river. St. Johns River Water Management District has put together the 3D model. And one of the questions that came up is, can we take all these data and match them to the model grid? So this figure here, the very small grid that looks like graph paper, is actually the grid that's put together in Cubeit, that then when we're doing the 3D plots, we have data output on every one of these grids. So you can see the fine resolution of the velocities that we're getting. At the coarser scale, you'll see the grid that's been put together for the 3D model. Of course, whenever you're doing modeling, you're fighting issues of how long does it take the computer to run my model. So you you have to have some compromises of grid size and so forth just to make it tractable to run. So the question was, could we actually take and output data at the model grid? And the question is absolutely yes. So the idea here is putting the model grid into Cubeit, running the processing, and coming up then with the complete data set. So your different components of velocity, whatever else you have in there, if you have other observations, if, for example, you did water quality measurements while you're collecting the velocity data, those could also be put in and transformed to the grid. And what this allows us to do now is start to do a much more detailed comparison of real-world measurements with the model results. For many years, when we do a model study, we'll have a handful of cross-sections, and we'll look at the vectors at those cross-sections that we've measured in detail and try to compare them with the model results there. And in fact, very often when we're doing modeling, it becomes a visual comparison. A lot of model studies, the calibration validation comes down a lot to here's how well we did at these few cross-sections. So we're moving into the territory where we can actually start to look grid by grid and how well did the model results compare, and use a couple of these data that we're collecting for the entire river with model results to help the modelers better calibrate and validate their models and understand where there might be areas where there needs a little bit more adjusting of parameters. So in a future webinar, we're going to talk more about that. I've got a PhD student doing his dissertation looking at ways to improve on this and come up with some metrics that will guide calibration. But that's a little bit of what's being done to contrast this real river for an entire reach and use it for comparing with the model.
Thank you, Art.
You're welcome.
So, yeah, so just to kind of close things up here, just to give you an overview of the summary of the accomplishments, which I think are significant. It's quite a challenge that the St. John's Water Management Group took on, and first of all, it was a great collaboration, or it has been, to really improve the overall workflow to collect, process, analyze the spatial data and velocity data in these complex river systems. It takes a lot of thought, takes a lot of ingenuity, and yeah, over the course of the past 18 months or so, we've been able to work together, develop a very nice tool that allows us to, from, again, door to door, 2 or 3 weeks, to be able to produce results that are useful for this modeling effort. We did this by, working together to optimize the data collection. Certainly, they know what they're doing when it comes to that. We did training. We made instrument recommendations. Certainly, they implemented multiple acquisition methodologies. Again, this single line or this high resolution velocity transects coupled with the spatial velocity data collection. There was a lot of complexities to overcome to dealing with the dense SAVs, setting that expectation of what we could get, how much time we should spend analyzing that data. We were dealing with a high cover with the georeference, implementing different types of data collection and GPS techniques, and certainly how to manage and collect data in some of these complex flow channels. At the end, the result was a very, very nice screening and processing tool, which we were able to visualize these results. That's really now going to help St. John's perform, more of their advanced analysis, comparisons like Art mentions, to validate models, and certainly to be able to efficiently manage all of that spatial data in multiple events. Because, again, in context, you have now 6 different data collection events with depth and velocity in almost 9 kilometers of river in a very complex river, and you have to be able to have access to that and manage that. So certainly they're set up to do that. And I think we are ready for some questions. So Diana, guess what? Back to you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Okay, so for those of you who might be new to GoToWebinar, there is a question dialog box in the bottom usually of your pane. If you have questions, please feel free to start entering those, and I'll field some of those and get the appropriate person to address them. And I already have a couple that were sent in earlier, so we'll start with those. One of the questions was, how do you know in a particular river reach how many instruments or ADCPs to use if you're going to utilize a go with the flow method? John?
Okay, yeah, so the decision in terms of first of all, quick answer is to use as few as possible, just because the time is money and equipment costs, so we don't want to overcomplicate it. But typically, for example, in the Silver River, there were sections that may have only required 6 to 7 transects to map that area, but in other areas of high complexity, it might take maybe 6 or 7, 12, 10 or 12 or more lines. And so typically we balance it out in terms of the flow conditions, how steady the flow is, how far we have to travel, and how many transects we need to make. Okay, so we looked at the Silver River. I think now they're using at least 3 or 4 ADCPs over a period of a few days. The river runs fairly steady to be able to do that. Okay.
Okay. And then were you going to comment too on also the channel width and the depth and how you kind of estimate how many ADCPs can go?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
It was about the range and depth. So if you're utilizing ADCPs and you have a certain channel width, how do you know how many you can put across, and is there also interference that you have to worry about?
Yeah, so typically, again, just speaking broadly here, in most rivers, you're going to want to collect it at maybe between 8 to 10 lines. The more the better. In more complex sections, you're going to want to add to that, kind of sort of, we call it pulverizing, where you'll actually go and just map a certain section with a lot of data if you've got a lot of changes in depth velocity. And typically, in terms of obstructions, there's 2 obstructions we deal with when we're mapping. That's the georeference with the GPS. There's different types of GPS systems that we can use, more or less, that can improve our data collection of the canopies, that can improve the signal quality, and we possibly have a webinar on just that at one point. In terms of the aquatic vegetation, the acoustic pulse doesn't penetrate. These pulses aren't strong enough to penetrate through the vegetation, but what they do is they actually reflect quite nicely off, because it's so dense in many cases, it reflects off the vegetation and treats it as really the depth. And so in that case, when we're dealing with obstructions, we're really looking at where we're truly getting the depth, where we're of the vegetation, or where we're getting the true bathymetric depth. I don't know if that answered the question, but that's a little bit about what we did on the Silver.
Okay. There's another question with respect to the flow. How do you verify that the flow is relatively steady during your data collection? And it's related to another question possibly too, so I just want to put this out there, and maybe it can be a 2-part. There's another question that came in about how will continuous gauging networks of the future need to change to support project-specific measurements like this? And what would you say are the most important attributes?
Okay, so I'll start with the first question about the river flow, which in terms of how do we maintain the consistency. And so when we're collecting data, there's many things that we need to consider. Number one, that the flow remains relatively steady. In this case, it's just the spring flows are relatively constant, but there's a series of water level stations that have been set up down the river that are monitored. Of course, there's a gauging station, I believe, down at the State Road 40 bridge at the downstream section, and that gauging station near the upstream station. All of that time series data can be reviewed and recorded. Certainly, at times when they go out there, they'll actually make discharge measurements. So there's a lot of, for instance, the water surface slope, the water level, and the actual flow. Those conditions are measured throughout the survey just to maintain an idea of how stable the river was. There's always going to be minor changes, but relatively speaking, in the duration of this type of data collection, the changes in flow were always very, very minimal, less than 1% during the event. So we could effectively look at this as a snapshot. Okay. back to the how continuous gauging networks of the future would change, I'm going to actually kick that one over to Art. Art, really what they're talking about is how could this be used to, or how would this change potentially project-specific measurements, and what would be the most important attributes of it?
Yeah, that's the question is a little, because how will continuous monitoring change? It really depends. A lot of times the continuous monitoring is less project specific. There's this idea of networks that are providing overall long-term trend analysis, and some of that probably shouldn't change. If we start changing too much, we lose the ability to do our trends and frequency analysis. On the other hand, you have projects like this one we looked at where we have an area that it is a project, but we anticipate it will be a long-term project, and really we need a coupling of continuous monitoring. We go back a little bit to the questions on steady state, and having some continuous monitoring really helps to address some of the questions how steady this was. We also, even with the density of data that are being collected on the study we looked at, you've got quarterly measurements, so you have 3 months in between. What is happening in between? And so what I do see as instruments become less expensive, it's easier to deploy some things. I anticipate we're going to start augmenting our long-term continuous monitoring with continuous monitoring for studies like this, where we put out a lot of instruments, perhaps less precise instruments, but they're making up for just having more instruments and more data. We can start to get a good picture of what's happening in between, and then the more detailed snapshot studies will augment that and help us refine the data. So that's some of the thoughts, how it'll change. I think there's a lot, 5 years ago we wouldn't have imagined what we just saw today.
Yeah.
And so as the technology changes, I think there's a lot of things we'll see happening that we can't even do today.
Okay, thanks, Art.
Okay. So John, there's we have probably time for 2 more questions, but there's one that came in about tidal conditions. So does this approach work in tidal conditions and in estuaries?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. Again, it breaks down into understanding the conditions in which you measured. So in tidal conditions, okay, rather we're going to start we're more interested, because things are changing all the time, in more synoptic type of conditions, or say we want to sample over an entire tide or a half a cycle. In that case, we're going to augment our data collection and possibly go away from the long spatial views to more of the transect, or what we call subcube views, which might be just maybe a obviously subsets of the river's course, but instead of looking at one snapshot over a continuous flow rate, we're actually going to look at a series of snapshots of flow. So we'll see, for example, along a section of river, we'll see the tide flux as it fluxes past our sampling location. We'll see the tide as it goes downstream, as it floods, as it ebbs. But again, say we might be outputting data, cross-sectional data or subcube data every 15 minutes to be able to look at it that way. Again, that's typically used in combination, and also that still will involve typically multiple events, because we might have, say, 3 or 4 or 5 ADCPs out on the river that are sampling very small locations again. So now each of those ADCPs are collecting data almost continually over the tidal cycle. They're generating cross-sectional and subcube views every, say, 10 to 15 minutes. And then again, we can build that all together to begin to look at these little snapshots in time and in space along that tidal river.
Okay.
Or unsteady river, I should say. Okay.
Okay, there's one more question here,
yep.
Somewhat closely related back to kind of the flow relative to your study time in terms of verifying that flow. But It goes back to how was the water surface level monitored in this particular example?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so let me just underscore, yeah, when we're measuring things, you know, over time, we need to have some sort of fixed reference, and so, or consistent reference, I should say. So water level is clearly one thing because it changes, and if we go out on multiple events, we have to know where the flow is relative to the last time we measured. So for the water surface slope, there's a couple ways. You can actually have an onboard GPS that has RTK that can sample the vertical. There's other ways you can do you can actually do physical surveys as you go down the river. You can have a survey rod with again typically with GPS or something to that level to hit survey points, water surface elevations along the river. Another way is to have a series of water level recorders, okay, that have been surveyed in upstream, downstream, and at different points in between. And so in the case of the Silver River, they've gone in with their survey team and they've actually surveyed in several, I think 10 or 12 survey points along the river from the head spring all the way down to the Akawaha, and they monitor those during the data collection. So we take that data from each of those water level recorders and we develop a water surface elevation, and then we apply that to each of the 5 beams that we beam map those ADCPs. So we collect we take the depth that we measured, we reference it to the water surface, so we can produce we produce 2 things: a depth and an elevation. Okay, and that elevation is always going to be referenced to that water surface elevation that's being sampled. Another way to do it, we've done it a couple times out on the Snake River with a very large gradient, say on the order of a meter or so or more in short range, using very good LiDAR. We can take actually LiDAR snaps of shots of the water surface and define that water surface as well. So there's several methods. On the Silver River, there's a series of gauges down the stream that have been surveyed in and recorded and provided to generate that surface.
Great. Well, John, I think we're going to have to wrap it up. So if you just head to the next slide here, just so people can see this.
Yes.
So I wanted to invite everybody to come onto our website at watercubedata.com. There are multiple white papers available to you on our resources tab. If you take a look at resources, there's not only white papers, but new tutorials that we've just recently posted on how to use Cubeit, and it really does go through a very nice demonstration as well. And I also want to invite you to come out and make sure you enter for our kayak. We gave one of these away at the very beginning of the year. Thomas Gast won that, and we had tweeted about it a little bit, but we're also planning to give another this year. We had an overwhelming response to it with people that wanted to at least be entered into this contest, and we'll be doing the same this year and giving one away at the end of the year, well, actually in the beginning of 2017. So I just wanted to thank you again, everyone, for participating, and we wish you well.
Yes, thank you, everybody, for attending.